Chapter 10, The Perceptual Guardrails. There is a natural question that arises once reality is understood as a curriculum. If consciousness is capable of expanding, why does it not simply perceive everything at once? Why are we not born with complete knowledge? Why does reality appear so limited? Why are certain truths hidden from us? Why can one person perceive something that another cannot? And why does expanded awareness so often arrive gradually rather than all at once? Within the framework developed throughout this book, these limitations are not necessarily defects in consciousness. They may be guardrails. A guardrail does not exist to prevent movement. It exists to prevent movement from exceeding what the structure can safely contain. The same principle can be applied to perception. Consciousness does not encounter reality in its totality. It encounters the portion of reality that its present structure allows it to perceive, interpret, and integrate. This limitation is not necessarily a prison. It may be one of the conditions that makes development possible. The necessity of limited perception. Imagine entering a vast library containing every book ever written, every language, every philosophy, every scientific discovery, every spiritual teaching, every biography, every description of every experience ever recorded. Now imagine being given immediate access to all of it simultaneously. Would that necessarily produce understanding? Probably not. Information without structure can become indistinguishable from noise. The problem would not be a lack of knowledge. It would be a lack of capacity to organize that knowledge. Human consciousness operates similarly. At any given moment, an individual can process only a fraction of what exists. Attention selects, memory selects, the senses select, interpretation selects, prior experience selects, expectation selects. Even consciousness itself, as it operates through embodied existence, encounters reality through particular limitations. The world is therefore not simply hidden from us, it is filtered through us. This distinction is important. The limitation is not necessarily imposed upon consciousness from outside. The limitation can arise through the very structure through which consciousness is currently expressing. The perceptual filter. A person does not simply see reality. They see reality through a configuration. Two people can stand in the same room and leave with completely different experiences. One notices the temperature. Another notices the conversation. One notices the architecture. Another notices the emotional atmosphere. One remembers what was said. Another remembers how it felt. Neither necessarily perceived the whole environment. Each encountered a different selection of it. This happens continuously. The senses provide information. The nervous system prioritizes some of it. The mind organizes it. Memory compares it against previous experience. Attention determines what receives emphasis. Consciousness then experiences the resulting representation as reality. The important point is not that perception is false. It is that perception is partial. The distinction between partial perception and false perception is essential. A window does not need to show the entire landscape to show something real. The guardrails of embodiment. The physical body itself establishes enormous perceptual boundaries. Human beings perceive only a limited range of light. We hear only a limited range of frequencies. We detect certain forms of pressure, temperature, movement, and chemical information. Other creatures inhabit sensory worlds that differ radically from ours. A dog experiences the world through an extraordinary olfactory field. A bird perceives dimensions of the environment unavailable to ordinary human vision. Other animals detect vibrations, magnetic fields, electrical signals, or frequencies that remain outside ordinary human awareness. This demonstrates something fundamental, the experienced world identical to the total field of existence. It is the portion accessible through the instrument of perception. The body is therefore not merely a vehicle for consciousness. It is also a perceptual interface. It establishes boundaries around what can be directly experienced. Within the curriculum model, those boundaries can serve a developmental function. Why would consciousness need boundaries? If the purpose of existence were simply to provide unlimited knowledge, perceptual restriction would make little sense. But if the purpose is development, limitation becomes intelligible. Consider learning any complex skill. A beginner is given a manageable task. The difficulty increases as competence develops. If the learner were immediately required to perform the most advanced version of the skill, The exercise could become overwhelming rather than educational. The same principle can apply to consciousness. A particular incarnation provides a particular range of perception. Within that range, consciousness encounters experiences, it forms interpretations, it makes decisions, it experiences consequences, it learns. The limits create the conditions under which that learning can occur. Without boundaries, the curriculum could lose its structure. Have the difference between knowing and understanding. There is another reason unlimited perception would not necessarily produce liberation. Knowing something intellectually is not the same as embodying it. A person can know that attachment creates suffering and remain deeply attached. A person can understand the concept of compassion and still respond harshly. A person can intellectually accept impermanence while desperately resisting change. A person can read thousands of pages about consciousness without directly recognizing the nature of their own awareness. Information can arrive instantly. Integration cannot always do so. This is why spiritual traditions place such emphasis on realization rather than accumulation of concepts. The purpose of the curriculum is not to fill consciousness with information. It is to transform the structure through which experience is understood. The guardrails therefore regulate not merely what can be perceived, but what can be integrated. The principle of progressive revelation. Expanded awareness often arrives incrementally. A person may encounter an idea and initially understand almost nothing about it. Years later, the same idea suddenly becomes obvious. The words have not changed. The person has. This happens repeatedly in spiritual development. A teaching is encountered. It seems abstract. Experience accumulates. Something shifts. The teaching is encountered again. Now it means something completely different. The information was present before. The capacity to receive it was not. This gives us an important principle. Open quote. Revelation does not always mean that new information has entered consciousness. Sometimes it means consciousness has developed the capacity to perceive what was already present. Close quote. This is why genuine spiritual development can feel less like acquiring something and more like seeing something that had been hidden in plain sight. The veil. Many spiritual traditions speak of a veil. The language differs across traditions, but the underlying idea is familiar. Ordinary consciousness does not perceive reality in its fullness. There is something between the individual and direct knowledge of reality. Within a Vedic framework, this can be considered through concepts such as avidya, the limitation of knowledge, and maya, the power through which reality is experienced through differentiated appearances and conditions. The veil does not necessarily mean that reality has been deliberately concealed by a malicious force. It can be understood as part of embodied existence itself. The individual experiences multiplicity. The individual identifies with body and mind. The individual encounters pleasure and pain, attraction and aversion, gain and loss, birth and death. Through these conditions, consciousness develops discrimination. Eventually, what was once experienced as the entirety of reality can be recognized as one layer of reality. The veil becomes thinner, not because reality suddenly changes, because perception does. Temporary blindness. This is where temporary blindness becomes particularly important. There are things a person may not yet be capable of seeing, not because they are stupid, not because someone is intentionally withholding the truth, because their present structure cannot yet accommodate the perception. A child cannot understand adulthood simply by being told about it. A beginner cannot see what an expert sees within the same situation. A consciousness operating through strong attachment may be unable to perceive the very attachment controlling its interpretation. This creates an interesting paradox. Sometimes the obstacle to seeing something is not the absence of information. It is the presence of an interpretation that makes alternative perception inaccessible. The person is not merely missing the answer. They are looking through a structure that prevents them from recognizing it. Hashtag samskara as a perceptual filter. Within the Indic framework, this can be related to samskaras. Samskaras are impressions carried within consciousness that influence tendencies, perception, reaction, and experience. A person does not encounter every situation from an empty state. Previous experience leaves impressions. Those impressions influence what is noticed. What is noticed influences interpretation. Interpretation influences response. Response creates further experience. Thus, the samskaric structure can function as a perceptual filter. Consider two people receiving the same criticism. One immediately perceives hostility, another perceives useful information, one becomes defensive, another becomes curious. The external event is similar, the internal field is different. The difference is not necessarily in the event itself, it is in the structure encountering it. This is one reason spiritual development cannot consist solely of changing external circumstances. The instrument of perception must also be refined. Guardrails. Preserve the lesson. Imagine a classroom in which every answer is written beside every question. There would be little need for inquiry. The student could simply copy the answers. The difficulty of the problem is part of the educational function. In the same way, reality does not necessarily reveal every consequence before an action is taken. We learn by encountering uncertainty. We make decisions without complete knowledge. We experience consequences. Then understanding develops. This is why perceptual limitation can preserve the integrity of the curriculum. If consciousness could see every consequence of every possible action with absolute certainty, many forms of learning would disappear. Uncertainty creates participation. Limited knowledge creates inquiry. Incomplete perception creates discovery. The unknown gives consciousness something to encounter. The mystery of not knowing. There is therefore a spiritual value in not knowing. The modern mind often treats uncertainty as a defect. If something cannot immediately be explained, the temptation is to fill the gap. But spiritual development can require the opposite discipline, to remain present within uncertainty, to observe without prematurely deciding, to allow reality to reveal itself through experience. Not knowing can become a form of humility. It prevents the mind from confusing its current model with reality itself. This is especially important within the framework of this book, because the cosmic curriculum cannot be fully understood from within one position inside it. The student is part of the system being studied. That creates an unavoidable limitation. We can investigate, we can observe, we can recognize patterns, but we should not mistake a partial perspective for total knowledge. Had expansion does not mean infinite information. When awareness expands, it is tempting to imagine that spiritual development means gaining access to increasingly enormous quantities of hidden information. But expansion can be much simpler. A person may become more capable of seeing relationships between things that were previously experienced as separate. They may recognize the pattern behind repeated experiences. They may perceive the motivation beneath a reaction. They may distinguish desire from necessity. They may recognize attachment before it becomes action. They may observe thought without immediately identifying with it. They may begin perceiving the movement of consciousness itself. Nothing external has necessarily been added. The field of perception has become more subtle. This is why spiritual evolution is not primarily an information race. It is a refinement of the instrument. The expansion of the field. As consciousness develops, the boundaries of accessible experience can change. A person who once perceived only immediate gratification may begin considering long-term consequence. Someone previously dominated by personal identity may begin recognizing collective effects. Someone absorbed in emotional reaction may begin observing the movement of emotion itself. Someone who previously saw only isolated events may begin seeing patterns. The field becomes larger. More relationships become visible. More possibilities become accessible. More subtle causes can be recognized. This is expansion. The world may not have changed. The consciousness encountering it has. From reaction to observation, one of the earliest signs of expanded perception is the emergence of a space between stimulus and response. Previously, event, reaction. Later, event, observation, interpretation, response. That additional space is significant. It allows consciousness to see its own machinery. A person begins to recognize, I am angry. Then, I am experiencing anger. Then, there is a pattern that produces anger under these circumstances. Eventually, what is the structure within me that this circumstance is activating? The experience becomes an object of investigation rather than merely something happening to the individual. The curriculum becomes visible when the guardrails move. A guardrail that prevents a beginner from falling may become unnecessary when the person has learned how to navigate the terrain. The same can happen with consciousness. A restriction may be necessary at one stage and unnecessary at another. A certain environment may force a lesson. Once the lesson is integrated, the environment may no longer exert the same influence. A recurring pattern may disappear. A temptation may lose its power. A fear may no longer determine action. An old identity may become irrelevant. The external structure has not necessarily been forcibly destroyed. Its function has been completed. This anticipates the later movement toward graduation. The curriculum does not need to maintain every restriction forever. Restrictions exist in relation to what consciousness has not yet integrated. The dissolution of blindness. Spiritual awakening is therefore not necessarily the acquisition of supernatural information. It can be understood as the gradual dissolution of perceptual obstruction. What was previously unconscious becomes conscious. What was confused becomes differentiated. What was identified with becomes observable. What was resisted becomes understood. What was feared becomes examined. What was repeated becomes recognized as a pattern. The individual begins seeing the machinery of their own experience. This is a profound change. The world remains. The body remains. Relationships remain. Circumstances remain. But the relationship to them changes. The student is no longer merely being moved through the curriculum. They are beginning to understand the curriculum. Why awareness must be progressive. There is also a deeper reason progressive expansion makes sense. Consciousness needs structure capable of holding what it perceives. A greater perception can create greater responsibility. To perceive more is to become capable of responding to more. With expanded awareness comes expanded discernment. With discernment comes responsibility. With responsibility comes the requirement for greater integration. Therefore, premature expansion is not necessarily liberation. It can become destabilizing if the structure required to integrate it has not developed. The curriculum, therefore, does not simply ask, open quote, can you see this? Close quote. It asks, open quote, can you live according to what you see? Close quote. That is a much higher threshold. Half the difference between awakening and accumulation. A person can accumulate spiritual concepts without expanding consciousness. They can learn the vocabulary of chakras, karma, kundalini, locus, devas, subtle bodies, reincarnation, and liberation, yet still react to life through the same attachments. The information has increased. The structure has not. This is why the true measure of expansion is not how much someone can explain. It is what they can perceive, integrate, and embody. Awareness that does not alter relationship with experience remains largely conceptual. The curriculum is completed through transformation, not vocabulary. Guardrails are not enemies. This brings us back to the central premise of the book. If reality is interpreted as a prison, every limitation becomes evidence of imprisonment. The body becomes a trap. The senses become restraints. Karma becomes a mechanism of punishment. Ignorance becomes deliberate concealment. Archons become jailers. The world becomes something to escape. But if reality is interpreted as a curriculum, the same structures acquire another meaning. The body becomes an instrument. The senses become a selective interface. Karma becomes correspondence. Ignorance becomes a temporary condition of learning. Boundaries become developmental structures. Archons, within the model proposed earlier, become administrators of lawful order. The entire relationship with existence changes. The question moves from open quote, who is keeping me here, close quote, to open quote, what is this structure allowing consciousness to learn, close quote. That is a profound shift. The guardrail is part of the path. A mountain path has boundaries because the mountain has dangers. A bridge has limits because weight and structure matter. A school has levels because learning occurs progressively. A curriculum has prerequisites because later understanding depends upon earlier development. The limitation is therefore not necessarily separate from the path. It can be part of the path. The boundary tells us something about the stage we are in. The obstacle tells us something about the capacity that has not yet developed. The recurring pattern tells us something that has not yet been integrated. The inability to perceive something may reveal precisely where development remains incomplete. The guardrail can therefore become information. When limitation becomes liberation. There is an apparent paradox here. The same limitation that initially restricts consciousness can eventually become the means through which consciousness expands. The body gives consciousness boundaries through which embodiment can be understood. The senses provide limited information through which perception can be refined. Relationships create attachment through which attachment can be recognized. Difficulty creates friction through which capacity can develop. Ignorance creates inquiry through which understanding emerges. The boundary creates the opportunity to discover what lies beyond the boundary. This is why the goal of spiritual development is not necessarily to destroy every limitation immediately. It is to understand the function of limitation. Once its purpose is understood, consciousness can move beyond what no longer serves it. Seeing the curriculum while still inside it. The deepest shift occurs when consciousness begins to observe the curriculum without needing to escape it. A difficult circumstance is no longer merely, why is this happening to me? It becomes, what is this revealing? A recurring pattern becomes, what structure continues to reproduce this experience? A limitation becomes, what capacity is being developed here? A delay becomes, what is not yet accessible? A relationship becomes, what does this interaction reveal about consciousness? A perceptual blind spot becomes, what am I currently unable to see? These questions do not guarantee immediate answers. They change the position from which the experience is approached. The individual becomes a participant observer within their own development. The purpose of the veil. Perhaps the veil exists not to keep consciousness ignorant forever, but to make discovery possible. If everything were immediately revealed, there would be no unfolding. If every lesson were explained before experience, there would be no realization. If every consequence were visible before action, there would be little genuine participation. If every answer were given before inquiry, there would be little wisdom. The veil creates distance. The curriculum teaches consciousness how to cross that distance. And as each layer is understood, the veil becomes thinner. Not because someone outside the system has decided to reveal another secret, because the consciousness within the system has become capable of seeing. Conclusion. The guardrails of awakening. Human perception is limited. That is not controversial. The deeper question is what that limitation means. Within the framework of this book, limitation need not be interpreted as evidence that reality is hostile. It may be one of the conditions through which consciousness develops. The body limits perception, the senses filter information, the mind organizes experience. Samskaras influence interpretation. Culture supplies assumptions, circumstance creates boundaries, ignorance creates inquiry, uncertainty creates participation. Together, these structures form the perceptual guardrails of embodied existence. They determine not everything that exists, but what consciousness can presently recognize, interpret, and integrate. As consciousness develops, these boundaries can change. What was invisible becomes visible. What was incomprehensible becomes intelligible. What was reacted to becomes observed. What was repeated becomes recognized. What was feared becomes understood. And what once appeared to be an impenetrable wall may eventually reveal itself as a boundary that existed only for a particular stage of development. This does not mean every limitation is pleasant. It does not mean every restriction should simply be accepted. And it does not mean suffering should be romanticized. It means limitation can have function without being punishment. The curriculum requires structure. Structure requires boundaries. Boundaries create the conditions for experience. Experience develops consciousness, and consciousness through development gradually becomes capable of perceiving beyond the boundaries that once defined its world. The purpose of awakening, then, is not to become someone who sees everything. It is to become someone who can see more clearly, to recognize the difference between reality and interpretation, between perception and assumption, between inherited structure and direct understanding, between what consciousness presently knows and what it has yet to discover. The guardrails were never necessarily the destination. They were part of the path. And perhaps the deepest sign that consciousness is beginning to awaken is not that the world suddenly becomes limitless. It is that the boundaries themselves become intelligible. What once felt like a prison begins to look like a lesson. What once felt like blindness begins to look like preparation. What once felt like restriction begins to reveal its purpose, and what once appeared to be the edge of reality becomes simply the edge of what consciousness was, until it became capable of seeing beyond it.